Good morning. Today is the 27th of Av and the 14th of August. And we are in Parashat Shoftim, and we're in the second portion. And the second portion is the most important public communal commandment of the Torah. It has many, many parts to it. And we'll try to get to some of them. And it says like this: when you enter the land that God your God is giving you, take possession of it and settle it. And you say collectively, I will appoint a king over myself like all the nations around me. You may indeed appoint a king over yourself, one whom God your God chooses. You must appoint a king over yourself from among your brothers. You may not appoint a foreigner, one who is not your brother, over yourself. And once he has been appointed, the only restrictions that the king must abide by, beyond those that apply to all Jews, are firstly that he not acquire more horses for himself than are required for his personal number of chariots. We'll talk about that hopefully. So that he not bring any of the people back to Egypt in order to procure those many horses. For God has said to you, you must never again return along that path. Secondly, he must not take more than a certain number of wives for himself, in order that his heart not be distracted from his royal duties. Thirdly, he must not acquire more silver and gold for himself than is necessary to finance his army. If the king abides by these restrictions, God will make sure that he sits securely upon his royal throne. He must write for himself 2 copies of this Torah on a scroll, one to keep in his archives, and one to take with him wherever he goes, copying it from the Torah scroll that is in the care of the Levitic priests. And the Torah must thus remain with him physically at all times, and he must read from it every day of his life, so that he may learn to revere God his God, to safeguard all the words of this Torah and these rules, to properly perform them, so that his heart will not become haughty over his brothers, and so that he will not deviate either to the right or to the left from a seemingly inconsequential commandment. And he should fulfill all these requirements in order that he might prolong the days he rules over his kingdom, he and his sons among Israel. So that's basically the entire reading today. I don't usually do this, I don't usually read the whole thing, but I wanted us to get an impression of this very important commandment. The Maimonides rules that when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, it was incumbent upon them to perform 3 commandments. The first was to appoint a king. The second, to annihilate Amalek. And the third was to build the Holy Temple. As we know, when they came into the land for about 400 years, they didn't do any of those. They sort of did a little bit. They had a skirmish with Amalek, but it wasn't anything of consequence. And there was no talk of a king, and there was no talk of the temple. The king, the temple, and Amalek go together. Amalek here is not, well, in their time it was an actual people. In our times, since there is no more people that we can point at, a nation that's like this, then it doesn't have a practical meaning to go and annihilate someone. That's not what it means. But it does serve as a counterbalance to the temple. It continues to serve that, and it represents the annihilation of what we call the evil inclination. And that's how we understand Amalek today, overwhelmingly, because there is no other way to practice this commandment. So, why are these 3 things, why do they go together? Well, like we said, Amalek and the temple balance one another. But there is another order that appears in one of the very early sources called the Sifrei. The Sifrei is a collection of laws, of statements from the 1st century before the Common Era. It's one of the most important halachic sources that we have. And there, Rabbi Yehuda writes that the order is to appoint a king to build the temple and then to annihilate the the nation of Amalek, or to annihilate the evil inclination. What is the purpose of a king? And right away when we mention anything like this, then we recall that when they finally did come around to appointing a king in the time of Samuel, Samuel was against it. Suddenly he was against it. And it's very strange because Samuel himself was the one who had the idea that there should be a king, and he anointed the first two kings, Saul and David. And yet he was against it. Why was he against it? Because there are two levels or two possibilities, two reasons for appointing a king, for having what we call law and order. The king, as a protector of the law, as a protector of liberties, of freedoms, of society, is a king like all kings, like the kings of all the nations of the world. Every nation of the world understands, and this is a basic human principle, that we need to have government in order to protect us from each other, basically. Because we need to have government, need to have something that we all agree upon, that we all submit to, so that we don't eat each other alive, as the statement in the Mishnah in Avot says. The people would literally swallow each other alive. It would be chaos, utter chaos. And so a king like all the other nations means that we want a king who will keep the law and the order. And of course, in the case of the Jewish people, the law and order comes from the Torah. That Samuel was against. Why? Why would it be against something like that? Because there is a second reason for appointing a king, which is a completely different reason. And to appoint a king from this second reason requires a level of maturity of the individuals deciding on what they want in their government that apparently the Jewish people did not have in Samuel's time, and he was disappointed because he felt that he had already brought the people to a point where they could appreciate this higher calling of the king. And what is that? The higher calling of the king is not to preserve law and order. That can actually be done by the courts. The court system, as we saw in the first reading of this parsha, has officers. The officers are the word Shoftim, which literally today are what we call police officers, the police. And the police are supposed to be the clerks of the court. The court, interestingly, in Judaism, is the same body that not only tries and judges, but also decides on the law. Meaning they're also the legal branch. They're both the legal branch, and to a great degree, they are the parliamentary branch. They're the part that decides on the laws. So they both decide the legal meaning of the law, and they also write the laws. That's how it is in the Torah. There is not a very strong separation between these two, but there are checks and balances in a different way. The king then, if the court does its purpose, if it serves its purpose properly, and it writes good laws, and it enforces them properly, the king is not supposed to enforce law. That's not his real higher calling. The higher calling of the king is to ensure that every individual is able to realize their potential. In other words, the king is closer to what we would call social services. It's actually a service that only the king can give, because he has almost absolute power to lift people and to send them down, to raise those people who need to be given an advantage, and to lower those people who are taking advantage of others. The purpose, the higher calling of the king, is to understand the potential of each individual in the nation. And this is a huge thing. This is not a simple thing at all. Obviously, the king needs many, many people working for him in order to achieve this. But he, in the end, is the final it gives the final decision on what the real potential of each individual is. And it's done more like social and psychological services. That's really what the king is up to most of the time. Now, he also has a check and balance over the court system. Because if the courts decide something, a law that he thinks is detrimental to society at large, he has the power to annul it. And if the courts decide to rule in a certain case in a way that he feels is wrong, he can take the case himself and try it however he thinks it needs to be tried. The idea being, again, that the courts are more interested in the community and the king is more interested in the individual. To be able to look down at the individual and to start rectifying society from there, not from the communal point of view, is the special quality that the king needs. Now, to find someone like that is very, very difficult. You have to have someone who has an incredible memory, incredible understanding of human nature, and more than anything, he has to have tremendous compassion. As the verse says in the prophets, u'merachamam yenahagim. The one who has compassion for them, he is the one who should lead them. And so this higher calling was something that in the time of Samuel, they weren't able to appreciate yet. And what they wanted in the end was a king who would be like the head of the army, someone who would protect them, in this case not so much from one another, although that was also a determining factor, but more that would protect them from the nations around them who were growing stronger. And so Samuel was against that. And when Samuel opposed it, because again he thought that they could do better, he didn't oppose it at the level of saying that it was forbidden. He was a prophet and he was the one who was interpreting the Torah, because he couldn't, because the first verse here says, Melech kechol ha'amim, a king like all the other nations have a king, because that first level of leadership does exist. However, the Torah is calling for something higher. And that requires a lot of work, first of all, on the individual. That each individual has to bring themselves to the point where they're willing to submit to a higher, call it an authority, again understanding that that authority has their best interest in mind. Without a doubt, I think that when someone looks at our recent history, we know such people. It's not that such people don't exist altogether, except calling them a king is a very interesting idea. You know, one of the people in recent history who really thought of himself in this way as a servant of the people was the famous Austrian Hungarian emperor Franz Joseph II. And he spent his entire life, he lived a very long life, I think he passed away when he was 83 or 84. He spent his entire life dedicating every single moment. He lived in dire asceticism, dedicating every single moment to meeting anyone who wanted to speak to him. He had open hours in his palace when anybody who wanted to speak to him could come. And he used all his connections and all his power to help everyone that he could. And so there were people like this. That's why everyone loved him, because they felt that he was serving a greater purpose than the parliament, than the judiciary. Another person who was like this was, without a doubt, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where people wanted him to take, in a certain sense, initiative and to take responsibility, and wanted him to lead them. This whole idea that there is a want from below, not just a need, but actually a whim, a real feeling that this is what we want, is where the Torah is really heading. We didn't get a chance with the appointment of a king. That should be the really higher level, understanding that the king is the highest function in the land, not because he has the highest authority necessarily, but because he has the highest responsibility for the well-being of every single individual that lives in his kingdom. And so in our day, we have glimpses of this. Social services, maybe some mental services, but in the end, there has to be a person who is really worthy of this task. And I don't know if you know that in England, not long ago, Theresa May, she appointed a minister of loneliness, of being lonely, that so many people are now lonely because of the shifts in how society is, that people are living longer and find themselves alone. So all these things would have been focused and concentrated in the office of the king, according to Torah. Again, this needs a lot more development. The king obviously is also the head of the army. There's a reason for that. He's also the head of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. That also needs to be discussed, why he needs these things. These two things, the army and the foreign affairs, I just want to mention them. In the ancient times, they were related to how many horses you had. Horses were chariots. Chariots were tanks. It was how much of a standing army you had. The Torah is against a standing army. It doesn't want the Jewish people to have a standing army. It doesn't want the king to control a standing army. It only wants there to be a reserve army, and that is a point that needs to be discussed in length. The foreign affairs has to do with how many wives he had, because in ancient times, the way that they would make agreements, treaties between nations was by marrying the daughter of the other king, or giving his own daughter to that king, and so on. So these two things, they need to be discussed separately, but we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining today, and hope to see you tomorrow.